Welcome to In the Weeds with experienced attorney Elisa Stewart.
Hello and welcome to In the Weeds with experienced attorney Elisa Stewart. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today we'll discuss how to grow and diversify in the cannabis industry. Elisa, good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
So how ripe is the market right now to start and scale a cannabis business?
I would say right now it is pretty ripe. The cannabis industry is operating in more than 40 states. There are businesses opening all the time. And more importantly, there are states that are opening to cannabis as we speak. Minnesota is in the process right now of reviewing applications for adult use. I think Pennsylvania is going to consider and open up soon enough. Ohio has recently opened up to adult use. And New York actually has recently opened up to adult use. They're still sort of, issuing their licenses, but those are happening. And so there is more opportunity now than when we first started, and there was just Colorado and California. So now is a really wonderful opportunity for the industry.
I've heard you say adult use a couple times, and I haven't actually asked you this, but is that the kind of the new term for recreational?
Yes. Yeah. Most of what I do, the regulatory framework, they talk about adult use as opposed to recreational use, because I don't know. I think everybody wants to stay away from recreational sounds like you could have an accident,
It's true.
So as lawyers, we like to say, no, it's adult. It's fine.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I can see that. What does the regulatory legal landscape look like currently for starting or growing a cannabis-based business?
It's complex. It is going to continue to be complex. It is a very regulated environment. So depending on what jurisdiction you're in, California is probably the most complex that I'm aware of because they have a dual oversight system. Both the local jurisdiction gets to issue permits, and then you can go to the state and get your state license. New York is a little less complicated because they've limited the local jurisdiction's involvement. But nonetheless, you still have a very, very complex regulatory environment. And in most instances, those regulations have not been very much. They haven't spent a whole lot of time traveling through the courts yet. We don't know how they're going to be interpreted. So we're sort of always operating in the gray. Some things have become very clear. We know we can't transport across state lines. That would be completely illegal. But other things are still somewhat gray, and we're all trying to figure it out as we go along. So it's complex, but it's also, I think for most businesses, the unknown can be fun, right? So yeah. It's an entirely new industry and opportunity.
We talked on the last episode about, the fact that it's eventually going to become federally legal. Do you see the regulatory issues and hurdles becoming easier for businesses when that happens?
Oh, no. What I see is a federal layer of regulatory oversight happening in addition to what's already happening, right? Mm-hmm. So the best case scenario is that the feds would to some degree defer to what the states have created.
Okay.
But we don't know if they're going to do that or not. They could create an entirely new regulatory landscape, and that would just sort of jar everybody that's already in existence. So it's definitely a time of uncertainty, but also great promise, because really we need it to be federally legal for these businesses to thrive. So we have to just take the Band-Aid off and get there. And I'm excited that that's happening.
Okay. Gotcha. I wasn't sure if maybe because if it was federally legal, then maybe the regulatory, I don't know, like I said, hurdles would ease a little bit, but it sounds like you're kind of anticipating the opposite of that.
I think there's going to be a third layer.
Yeah. So what are the key challenges that face cannabis businesses who want to start or expand?
Access to capital. That's a big one. It is very hard to attract investors or to raise money for your startup because it's just, it remains federally legal, and that impacts banks. It impacts people who are able to loan money. It impacts investors from coming in. And so money is probably one of the biggest issues. And then there's legal restrictions in this regulatory environment that we all operate in. And so there's an additional cost to be able to navigate that regulatory environment. You have to pay attorney's fees, or you might have to pay for a consultant to help you get through that, process. And finally, and this may be mostly happening in California, but there is areas that are saturated and areas that are complete deserts. So, for a lot of people who think to themselves, hey, I'd like to open a dispensary in Los Angeles because so many people travel there, so many people live there, that would be great. Well, it's completely saturated. There is more dispensaries there than we need, quite frankly. And then in other parts of the state, it's a complete desert because the state has let the local jurisdictions decide whether or not they're going to have cannabis within their borders. And so we have, huge swaths of the state where there's just no dispensaries, whatever. And that, that's been challenging. So the first thing you're going to talk about with your clients is where they choose to open. Trying to direct them to a desert is probably the best course of action, but it's also challenging because people want to be in places like San Francisco or LA.
Sure.
Because they think that's the best, but it may not be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mentioned at one point that you can't use credit cards. At least here in Colorado, you can't use a credit card when you go to buy cannabis. Why is that?
So that happens because it's considered money laundering for banking institutions to use money from drug proceeds, and because federally cannabis is still a Schedule I substance. Making money off of cannabis is essentially money laundering, and that's the issue for them. That's why they will not come into the market until they can do so legally.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you. I was always curious about that. I've never really looked it up or understood why that was. How do local and federal laws impact businesses' opportunity for expansion?
Well, federal laws are simple. You can't operate, right? But the way they impact local businesses and states is that they can't ship their product across state lines. They can't mail it directly to their customers. And that limits them to only be able to service people in their state. And because you can't mail it, you're usually trying to, deliver it in a vehicle in a jurisdictional region or, like a region that you can reach. So those federal laws, the federal illegality it impacts the reach of local state businesses. And state laws are also limiting on cannabis businesses because they reflect federal law. They don't allow, like California explicitly does not allow anybody to transport their products out of state. But interestingly, you cannot transport your cannabis products, onto a tribal reservation, as an example, because those are sovereign nations. And California made the decision that the only way that a tribal nation could participate in the cannabis market was to waive their sovereignty. And of course, why would you ever want to do that? So they've had very little participation in that way. And that has really slowed growth for both tribes and the larger cannabis industry to, do trades and operate with one another. That's been a bar, which has been, disappointing from my perspective.
Yeah. I wanted to ask too, back to the money aspect. What are some of the legal implications of investing in cannabis related ventures now or in the near future?
So it's interesting. The investing part is very interesting because United States businesses, no matter what state you're in, you cannot list, if you're a cannabis business, you cannot be listed on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange because it's federally illegal. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses that do the same, they can list on the New York Stock Exchange and, NASDAQ as an example, and they benefit from all those public dollars that goes towards their businesses, but not to American businesses. And that is particularly frustrating. And because while it remains illegal, that's a whole capital industry, right? All this opportunity of large investors who could put money into these businesses and help grow. That can't happen because of it's federally illegal still. And that's really frustrating, I think, for cannabis businesses. And so there's all sorts of weird and creative ways that cannabis businesses try to get onto the Canadian, stock market. But really, people like to list on the American Stock Exchange because, we attract a lot of interest. And so being barred from that is a big ban. It's a challenge for people. But investors can still invest. They have to be creative. I do hear stories about people trying to invest in cannabis stocks and being told that their broker won't let them invest their money that way. So you really have to do it on your own and be creative about how you invest.
Let's say I have a cannabis business. What are indicators that it's time for me to scale? When should I be like, I might want to scale this thing?
Yeah. So that's you're have more cash flow coming in than money going out, right? So you have more profitability than you're paying in expenses. And so you're building up a cash reserve. There's a demand for your products is another indicator. You routinely sell out and people still want more, right? There's an opportunity to expand. And because we're in cannabis and it is hard to access loans and other capital for expansion, one of the things that you want to do is if you have profitable cash flow, you want to build up your reserves and, figure out what jurisdiction you're going to go into next. And do you have the money for the permitting and the licensing and the build out that you need to do? Because if you have to take out a loan, there is loans available for cannabis business. I don't want to suggest that there's not, but they tend to be a lot more pricey than just regular business loans. And because of that, it's more expensive money. More expensive money is, it costs more. So, if you can do it just on your cash, that is preferable. Because the other thing you come up against when you go and you expand is you're almost always expanding into a different jurisdiction. And that means you have to understand that jurisdiction's rules and their particular regulatory environment that you're operating in. And so making sure you have sufficient capital, cash reserves to make that jump is where, is how you want to sort of make that decision making. And just keeping an eye on your finances, make sure you understand where your money is and what's happening.
So how do you recommend owners approach the expansion process? Can you kind of give me the steps?
So first, I'd make sure I had a good accountant and, either accountant or a CPA working with me so that I understood that I had very good concrete cash controls, that I was keeping track of my taxes in a way that's not creating a liability for me, and that I have sufficient cash reserves on hand that will cover the expenses that the business projects they're going to be incurring. And then you also want to have the assistance of either a consultant or an attorney for permitting and licensing to make sure that you understand what those, whether or not you're even going to be able to get the permit. Are you going to be eligible? Do you have everything that you need to complete that application? Is the jurisdiction accepting new applications, right? Like there's a lot of things to make sure that you understand. And so the first step is really financial, making sure you have your financials in line. And the next step is sort of, an attorney or a consultant to help you to pick out which jurisdiction would be work for you and whether it's open and whether it's viable.
How about some of the challenges? What are the challenges that you see that cannabis businesses face when scaling, and how can they prepare for them in advance or overcome them?
The biggest challenges really are having the capital, right? And making sure that you understand the jurisdiction you're moving into. Those two are the biggest hurdles to expanding into a new jurisdiction. I can give you one example of something that happened fairly recently. Had a group that had a number of dispensaries in Los Angeles, wanted to expand to a different jurisdiction, and had actually gone through the process of getting a CUP in a small city in Riverside County. But they didn't check to see what the cap was, as an example, on how many dispensaries that particular jurisdiction was giving out. There was already 17 dispensaries open in this very tiny city, right? And they were going to be like the 18th or something like that. And there's other businesses that had been operating for a time prior, and businesses that were not operating successfully and were unhappy that they were opening it back up to other dispensaries to open. And from the city's perspective, they were like, well, those businesses aren't working, so let's just have new businesses come in and we will take their money. And who cares what happens to those existing businesses?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we want our money. We want our tax dollars.
Really knowing the jurisdiction that you're moving into, understanding what the challenges are of that particular jurisdiction, how many existing businesses are there? How many more are they going to allow there? Those are really critical. It's just good planning, right? That's really what you need to do before you take that expansion step, because otherwise a big loss is, nobody can, it's more challenging for cannabis businesses to suffer a big loss because they don't get to deduct their business expenses.
Right. I mentioned I'm in Colorado, so lots of breweries here. And I see a lot of breweries fail. I see a lot of breweries that don't last very long or last a couple of years, then they're gone. I've talked to people before where, a lot of times these people they're really good at brewing beer and they don't know anything about business and they just can't make cash flow work. They just don't understand how to save money. They don't understand any of that stuff. They don't get the right people. Do you see that in cannabis as well, especially being that it's still so new?
Yes. And the reason why we probably see it even more frequently in cannabis is because there are a lot of jurisdictions that have done what are called social equity programs, which I am a supporter of. I like social equity programs. I think the people most impacted by the war on drugs should get a benefit of the legal industry now. However, right, just because you were a great legacy grower, right, doesn't mean that you're going to be able to translate that skill into, a scaled cannabis business.
Right.
So growing in your garage is a lot different than growing in a greenhouse,
Yes.
right? And I think some people are like, I was a great grower, but it does not translate. And in addition, like you may have been really successful growing in your garage because you also weren't paying taxes. There was a lot of other things that made it, more profitable, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You didn't test anything. You didn't do track and trace. You didn't have quality control. And it's been very hard for legacy operators to transition to the legal market. Very challenging. And so I've seen a lot of those businesses fail, sadly so. I think that if there was more support in the local jurisdictions that have these social equity programs about, business resources, advice, tax advice, business advice, we would perhaps see more success.
Yeah, it's like I make some really good ribs on the smoker. Doesn't mean I'd have a successful successful restaurant up down.
That's exactly
street,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How does having a cannabis law attorney by your side help you during the process of growing and scaling?
Because we have already traveled this route with other clients. So we understand what's going to be required of these businesses, generally have a better understanding of the expenses associated with them. Just from my work that I've done with a variety of businesses, I've sort of developed relationships with engineers and architects and business advisors and accountants and CPAs. And I can tap into that and bring that to the table for people. And that's really the function that I'm providing in addition to legal advice about, the regulatory environment that they're going to be working in and operating in, but also all of these other things that I can bring to the table to assist them or support them.
Having one store is one thing. Franchising or not franchising, I guess, but like having multiple locations it's a whole other animal. And I would imagine a lot of people are excited to do it, but maybe aren't really, don't really understand what that means for them and their business and their managers and the people around, people involved in the business.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And in cannabis, when you move into a different jurisdiction, not only do you have like all the challenges of starting a new business, you also have sometimes a totally different regulatory environment to operate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so difficult to deal with from one place to another. Yeah. Wow. Well, there's lots to consider if you want to grow, if you want to scale. Well, if you want to grow the product at first, and then also if you want to grow the business, there's a lot of things to consider. So I think having an experienced attorney is a good thing. So thank you for all your tips. And thank you for tuning into In the Weeds with experienced attorney Elisa Stewart. For more information or to connect with Elisa, you can visit stewartlawpc.com and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments. Elisa, great to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.